Ladies and gentlemen, we are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. We're going to be talking about the resurrection of Jesus, obviously continuing the series of a critical examination. But we're talking about the honorable death and burial of Jesus. And this whole chapter that is in Jonathan MS Pearce's book, this book here, if you haven't already jumped on and got you a copy, this is an interesting examination, and we're going to hear some fun stuff according to what Jonathan has dug up. He's looked at a lot of the scholars out there and checked this stuff out. So let's get the show started. As you guys will trickle in, we're going to do our intro. I'm going to show you a few things, and then we're going to obviously get into the meat. So with that being said, let's get started. You could tell by that music that we ain't playing no games. This is awesome. I'm really excited because his book is actually knocking over the Jenga tower of the resurrection. But, you know, Jonathan's late to the game. I'm late to the game, right? Like there's plenty of people in history who've been poking holes and showing problems. And a lot of the research that he did is a very interesting chapter. Let's put it that way. What we're going through is going to kind of point out a lot of different things. It's a very short chapter, but there's a lot of detail that I think is necessary to get into. So as we start to dive in, I want everybody to check out his YouTube channel. I commented that in the comments section. You can go and join his YouTube channel here, A Tippling Philosopher. Let's grow those numbers. Let's get him more subscribers than 513. So hopefully when I get done with this recording, I can go and look at the subscriber rate and see that it went up and be like, you know what, I can count on MythVision. MythVision, you guys help grow YouTube channels. People I bring on gives them reasons to come on. In fact, lots of the scholars that I've had on really appreciate coming on to MythVision because you guys are so active and involved in the research that we're doing. We're taking stuff that like you usually go to an academic college or something like that to learn and making it popular. So that's what I love about you guys so much. Also, here's the book. If you haven't got the book, get it on ebook. You can get a paperback. I've got me a paperback copy. The Resurrection, A Critical Examination of the Easter Story. He has many other books, and we're going to dive into those as time goes by. We're going through the series now on this one. And then, of course, last of all, I've got the Patreon. I've also commented that in the comment section. Let me pop that back up here on the screen, let you guys see. The Patreon is a way of helping me continue doing what I'm doing. You get early access, and you get to steer in which direction you like to see certain content. You can have a video question of your own. I interview the scholars that I go see and I ask them. And oftentimes you'll get your own video in 1080p and make history and say, you know what? When that man is long gone one day, because that's just the way it is, or woman, like Elaine Pagels, I went and interviewed her and man, we got like 40, 50 videos. One day she won't be around. And you can look back and say, there's a video where I got to ask legendary Elaine Pagels this question, and she responded to my question. That is one of the things I do and I leverage to try and make MythVision not only a family event where you're part of a family and you can help make a change, but also, you know, you get early access. So there's like little things, and I'm continuing to learn more. I just dropped the historical Muhammad yesterday. Fantastic 2-hour interview with a PhD expert, because I get a lot of Muslims who are like, oh, you have these ex-Muslims and that's it. Why have ex everybody? You know, I always like to talk about deconversion stories. I relate to people who leave these faiths and look to critical thinking. But this guy is an expert. I mean, like, there's no going around and acting like this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. If you hear that, then they're just trolling you because they don't know what they're talking about. Anyway, there's a long plug. I just had fun. I had to let everybody really know why this is so important. And,
it turns out, Derek, that you've got a lot of exes, but there you go.
I got a lot of exes. And the interesting thing is all my exes have nice things to say about me. I don't know about you, but just
none of my exes have got PhDs. I don't think so. Well, actually, I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about that.
Yeah, I think there's some. I have some PhDs who I think were once Christian. I mean, Dennis McDonald was once a devout Christian, and then of course, later in his years, he is an atheist who's still sympathetic. Don't get me wrong, but he's not like anti-theist or like hardcore, but nonetheless, he is an atheist.
And I've just been getting back into Dennis McDonald, actually, largely on the back of what you've been doing, because I do have some of his books, and one that I was kind of halfway through reading, and it's just got me back into the McDonald zone. So, I've got you to thank for that. So that's good stuff.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm glad you guys are tuning in live. Everybody's here. We got people trickling in as we go. Guest camera is
Can I just say I'm never going to be as colourful as you, but I've come packed with stash. Look, Atypical Philosopher, and my cup of tea is in Atypical Philosopher thermal mug. How
hold on, show that again because it glitched. Snap!
Thermal mug.
Yeah, my wife actually created some fan art, or if you will, like apparel for MythVision.
Yeah.
And we're doing that in the Teespring. We've got like a little mug with we are MythVision, and then the other side's got my little logo, and
nice.
So we're starting to do more on the Teespring. So if people are wanting to do that, I am like hoping and expecting people who do buy the apparel to send me a picture of them wearing it or using the coffee mug or whatever, so that I can like broadcast it to everybody and show everybody like we are MythVision.
You've won in life when
yeah, man, that'll make me feel great. How do we begin this? Because
what we've previously talked about is we talked about an awful lot, haven't we? And we started off this journey with a look at the philosophy and theology to do with atonement and to do with the Holy Trinity, and that doesn't make sense. So we don't need to do any of this analysis, because the whole notion of the resurrection based upon the resurrection of a God-man figure, spirit, that atones for sins doesn't make any sense, and the Trinity doesn't make sense. So this is all of this part of the series is irrelevant in one regard. But if we're going to go down the path of analyzing each of the gospel accounts and Paul for what they actually claim, then none of that makes any sense either, for a whole host of reasons, but both sort of internal contradictions within the gospel accounts, but also what we know about the history. We talked previously about the trial, about how the trial never would have happened. So historically speaking, it just, that's a load of nonsense. The whole thing looks like Yom Kippur, a rewriting of that. So you've got, Barabbas being set free and Jesus being executed as the two goats of the Yom Kippur. And so we've gone through a lot of stuff to now have arrived at the point where Jesus is being executed and then being interred somehow in, the Gospels will say, in an empty tomb. So that's what we're going to look at today, and that's interesting because we have historical records and other sources to be able to cross-reference the claims of the gospel against, and that's always good, because you look at the middle part of Jesus' life, there's no areas that you can cross-reference some of those miracle claims of his life, but now we're getting to areas where we can safely say this probably didn't happen, because we've got these sources that show that wouldn't happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely, and that is going to be the interesting part. I think the historical reality, comparing it to what we find in the text and how things operated, from burials, you name it, is all discussed in this short chapter. And it's really interesting. Real quick, I just want to give a shout out to Jojo Freelancer. He did spend some good time making this art. And the other day he posted that. We were at 32,800 subscribers just like 2-3 days ago. We're at 33,000. We're growing. And thanks for that art, Jojo. I really appreciate it. So you guys, I love the fan art. People who are making MythVision art, man, I'm going to obviously want to share that. I love it. You guys are creative. So where do you want to start exactly in particular? Because I find it fascinating that the way it's portrayed in the Gospels, it's written from someone who's obviously a biased believer on the side of Jesus. They're claiming that he's being killed for these horrible things, blasphemy, etc. And yet he's treated delicately in the sense that, like, okay, we're gonna do this, we're gonna bury him in a nice tomb, we're gonna, like, the way it's painted. And you go into a lot of the historical, what would be considered actual verisimilitude, what would have happened. And that's the difference. Like, you make a claim, just to throw this out there, Jesus didn't die on a cross. He was killed and then hung up on a cross, or hung up on a tree or on a pole or something like that.
So what do we know? We know from a variety of sources. So you've got the Talmud, which is sort of rabbinic law, which uses, the Mishnah, which are oral traditions written down. And therefore we've got really good knowledge of what Jewish law was at the time. And we know, but also we have the Hebrew Bible, which makes a whole load of moral, regulatory, jurisprudence claims within it. And all of this points to the fact that Jesus would have, blasphemy and high treason were the two worst forms of crime. So Jesus has committed the worst crimes you can commit. So we also know that the way that you were executed and buried reflects your criminality. So therefore, if you've committed the worst crime, you should expect the worst punishments, or certain types of punishments, and dishonorable burials. So dishonorable death and a dishonorable burial because of what you have done. What the Gospels claim is that Jesus did receive a dishonorable death, but then almost straight away was afforded a great deal of honor by Joseph of Arimathea, taking him down from the cross, putting him in what later becomes, arguably his empty tomb, and given an honorable burial in that manner. So we're going to look at that, but I think starting with just the idea that, and we know this from Mark 14, Matthew 26, John 19, that Jesus was done for blasphemy or high treason. Some people think that maybe the Romans did him for sedition, but I think the Gospels really bend over to make the Jews culpable for the death of Jesus. And
I also, this is something interesting that really started to spark in my mind as we looked at what is chronologically the order of the New Testament. And if Paul does come first, as all the scholars out there pretty much say, even Dr. Bob Price, who has like radical views of Paul as a Dutch radical, a contemporary Dutch radical, still has this idea where he plays that Paul does come before the Gospels. What I find fascinating is that even in Paul, it seems he's blaming Jews. In many ways, he's like accusing them. There's a stumbling block, this, that, for a lot of stuff. And they're always like, you guys didn't listen. You rejected the Christ. I mean, all of these things that kind of build up. If you allow continuity into the Gospels, right? If there is that continuity, then it's like, well, who are the culprits? According to the narrative, no wonder they're accusing Jews. I do want to know, let me know when we can do super chats, because we've got already one. And or do you want to hit it real quick, then we can begin?
Whenever you want to go. I just, on your point there, though, you only have to look at the trial to show that the Gospels clearly want the Jews to be the people responsible for Jesus's sentencing and death, but also the idea that Pilate went, "Who do you want to set free?" Like he was happy enough to set Jesus free. And so this is the Romans getting off, because you've got to remember as well that the Roman Empire would have been the audience for some of these Gospels. So if the Gospels are going to the Gentiles and saying, look, Jesus as God or the Messiah was crucified and it's your fault and it's the Romans' fault, obviously this is going to land on infertile ground. So actually they really need to say, and it's not your fault. Your guy Pilate said, I'll let one of you free, and it was selected that it was Barabbas and not Jesus. So this was the Jews' fault. These are our guys' fault. So don't worry about that. Anyway, how about you believe in Jesus?
Well put. I'm going to hit these up. Mr. Monster, thank you for the super chat. He says, what is the biggest piece of physical evidence, notice physical, that could even remotely relate to a historical Jesus character? I know about the Pilate stone, though.
So often these days, I'm still hearing people bang on about the Shroud of Turin, even though that has been like resoundingly debunked. And I'm no expert on that, but there are just massively detailed debunkings of the Shroud of Turin. But then there are massive books. I mean, someone sent me a book, a Christian author sent me I don't know if it's an 800-page book on the Shroud of Turin, saying, look, you should read my book. This is, and you know, I don't have the time to go into that much detail over something that I just think is fanciful at best.
Yeah. As far as physical evidence, you know, I just read this book by Sean W. Anthony on Muhammad. Did Muhammad exist? Right. I've got some books back here that try to say he didn't exist. There are people who are trying to make the claim that Muhammad didn't exist. Well, after listening to this scholar and other scholars that are in the vein, that are like, yeah, there was no reason not to think there was a Muhammad, that there was a guy who started this thing. The evidence to me in the Muhammad case, just using that as an example, there is no physical evidence other than literature. And oftentimes the literature is conflicting accounts about what they remember about the prophet, etc. But all we have is really this literature and the fact that there was a movement that developed, and we have outside sources that are claiming there's this guy who's a prophet who claims to have the keys to paradise, etc. He's bloodshed, etc., etc. Like he's killing people. There's no physical evidence. And this is an interesting point he points out. 99% of all humans ever don't have any physical evidence to prove they existed.
Yeah, good point.
So, like, this question is becoming more and more of a point that I think people are dying on a hill that is totally a distraction from,
it's a really good point.
It's a distraction to me because it's like, all right, I don't see any reason why there couldn't have been a basic guy at the bottom. It's fun to entertain both ideas, but it's not to me worth like dying on the hill. No, there couldn't have been a Jesus because there's so much myth about him. There may not have been, but I'm saying let's work within the sandbox. Let's assume for once humans existed in the past. To me, it's very likely humans did exist and that humans were mythologized.
Yeah.
There is no physical evidence though. If you're asking for like, you know.
No, and what you could say, I mean, I have a chapter on this in the book, a chapter on the veneration of the tomb, the fact that the tomb is not venerated, which means a couple of things. So you would expect tombs to be venerated, especially if that is the place of death or interment of God, right, or the Messiah. There's absolutely no doubt that his followers would eventually, perhaps in secret to begin with, but if they knew where it was, it would be venerated, as it is today, supposedly, even though that's not the place. But the problem is, and I do treat my chapter on the veneration, you know, I look at both sides. On the other hand, Jerusalem was destroyed pretty much. And so therefore, that even if they did know where it was, upon the destruction of Jerusalem, the razing of the city, then arguably no one would actually know where Jesus was buried. But I still think on balance that there is no veneration shows that I think the empty tomb was a later invention by Mark onwards. And actually no one knew where the tomb was because there was no tomb.
Interesting. Thank you, Mr. Monster. I gave you my opinion, of course. I mean, it is just an opinion, but I mean, it's an opinion after listening to hundreds of hours in person and probing into these scholars who are both mythicists and historicists, where I've kind of like started to see, okay, hold on. We're not even getting past this point. Like we would require physical evidence to know that Jesus exists without just using a historical critical method. Now, I wish there was physical evidence. We could really verify and things like that, but at the end of the day, I don't need it to hypothesize and lean that there was a guy at the bottom of the barrel. That's just for me. After seeing if you look at the historical Muhammad material that I've been reading with these scholars, you'd walk away going, okay, I see. Like they did this with Muhammad and he wasn't walking on water and doing all these things. They still mythologized him later and created these elaborate narratives making this guy do things he didn't do. He went to this place. No, he didn't go to that place. He went to this. There's so many things that they do to try and mythologize him. And I have no reason to say there wasn't a guy there. Scott Daniel, thank you so much for the super chat. I rather like the idea that the Russians crucified Jesus. Excellent work, both of you. Scott, you're a trip. Thanks for the super chat, man. I appreciate it.
It was actually the start of the Cold War, and it is why America got so annoyed because it turns out it was them damn Ruskies that did it.
Well, didn't you hear Jesus is one of the greatest Americans who ever lived? I mean, that's a known fact. Like
prosperity gospel and all. So I think that the place to look at initially with the execution of Jesus is that he wouldn't have been crucified. So this is the first thing I think that needs to be laid out, is that crucifixion wasn't a huge thing at the time, and certainly for someone who would have committed the crime of high treason or blasphemy, would have been stoned. Okay, so it would have been stoned, and it looks like, from what we can glean from different sources, it looks like what probably would have happened is someone like Jesus would have been stoned to death and then hung on a post in order to be a deterrent to those who walk by, and then taken down before sunset, as we'll come on to in a little while. But stoned and then hung on a post. And in fact, there are little sort of nuggets we can get from even from inside the Bible itself. I think from
is it that Mark 16 burial thing?
Yeah. So I mean, there's so many quotes.
I've got it right here on the screen, and I hope that they could see it.
Well, yeah, no, not yet on that one, but
okay.
So just Galatians 3:13, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. It is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. And then we've got the Mishnah Sanhedrin 6:4. So his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but you shall bury him that day, for that is for he that is hung is a curse of God. So basically, there's lots of ideas going on here, but stoning and then hung on a post as a deterrent is the most probable thing that would have happened. And the thing about dead bodies is that they were a real curse, and they were a defilement. So what you did with the body afterwards was hugely important, and this is very clear within Jewish law. Just Leviticus also, just to throw in something that it has, Leviticus 24, the one who blasphemes the name of the Lord shall be taken outside the camp, and let all who heard him lay their hands on his head, then let all the congregation stone him. Mm-hmm. And then
put it bluntly, what you titled this little paragraph here, Jesus would have been stoned. Yeah. So we're not talking about marijuana, okay? We're not talking about, yeah. But like, if the accounts that what we have in the Gospels are true in some sense at all, he would have been stoned. Now the question then, and before we even get into this, is this assuming he's claiming to be God? Because Bart Ehrman, for example, even in his, like, he's going to be doing an episode coming up talking about, no, Jesus would have never claimed that of himself.
I'm with Bart Ehrman on this. I think Bart Ehrman is right. So How Jesus Became God is a really good book, mm-hmm. in which he sets out a kind of exaltation scenario where Jesus, particularly from Mark, Matthew, and Luke, Jesus would have been a Messiah. And I really do believe this. I don't think the synoptic gospels thought Jesus was a God, right? So they thought he was a Messiah, and therefore his death and resurrection would have been a way of him being exalted in heaven as a really special individual, as a Messiah. And it's only later, as I said with John, which is why John has Jesus as the Paschal Lamb. John has the Logos. John is very different from the other Gospels and sees Jesus as a more divine form, because he's writing later and these kind of theologies are being developed. But there would have been competing political, theological sects that were trying to work this stuff out and arguing with each other. And, hence, Paul writing letters arguing about how the resurrection works to the Corinthians and so on and so forth. It all would have been a really interesting time of people trying to work out what the hell has just happened, because I believe as a historicist that Jesus was just a cult leader who people thought there was a Messiah. He ends up getting executed, and then they go away and then they try and work out how this works by going through the Old Testament, finding out a bunch of scriptures, throwing it at Jesus, reinventing Jesus and reformulating that narrative into an Old Testament verified new narrative with invented events that conform to the theology they had in mind.
So let's just assume what you're saying is there's a kernel here of history. You think there was a guy who actually was killed, most likely by Jews, stoned to death. what would you say? Because you do an interesting thing in your book when you say, this is my thoughts. I know the Gospels say Pontius Pilate's in the story. Nah, I don't think that's historical. I think they added this in, making Romans look good, by the way, versus, Jews. But if you look at this, what do you think he was stoned to death for in reality? Since it seems like he's blaspheming God, do you think he was being stoned for blasphemy?
Yeah, so I think there are two competing theories in the skeptical circles. One is it's some kind of sedition against Rome, and it could be the Romans involved, but then that got morphed into being the Jews being responsible for, and it becomes sort of more blasphemy rather than, or it's simple blasphemy for going to Jerusalem during the Passover festivities, maybe, and saying things that were highly controversial that the Sanhedrin didn't like, and he rubbed people up the wrong way. He was like a revolutionary. Cultic figure that they thought, right, this doesn't conform with our conservative views about how things should be. Therefore, let's get him, put on trial and executed. It wouldn't have happened at all like it did in the Gospels. So the trial wouldn't have happened anywhere like it was claimed to have happened, because that would have been a legal trial, and it just, we went through this last time. There's no possibility that trial would have happened. But some kind of trial and execution, I would claim, is a gist memory, as Bart Ehrman would say, is a memory of the real Jesus. So he's wound either the Romans or the Jews up the wrong way, and he's been executed as a result. Can we know 100% who he rubbed up and exactly why? Well, not really, because we're gleaning all of this from the Gospels that are just incredibly heavily overlaid with theology. And so I think trying to work out definitely what happened is impossible. Trying to make some inferences is the best we can do. Yeah.
So please continue. I figure I'd ask that because, it's a tricky one. It's an interesting question.
So one more quote I wanted from Josephus, who said, "Let him who blasphemes God be stoned to death and hung during the day, and let him be buried dishonorably and out of sight. And when he has continued therefore one whole day, that all the people may see him, let him be buried in the night. And thus it is that we bury all whom the Lord's condemned to die. Upon any account whatsoever, let our enemies that fall in battle be also buried, nor let one dead body lie above the ground or suffer a punishment beyond what justice requires." So he very clearly talks about, blaspheming and being stoned to death. So that was just that other source I wanted. I think it's highly likely that he would have been stoned to death. But if you really, really want to argue a crucifixion, then he wouldn't have been crucified on the old sort of crucifix style of cross that you see hanging around people's necks. That wouldn't have happened for a whole bunch of reasons. I mean, we've got very little evidence that was the case. In fact, the first evidence we got that was that Jesus was crucified on something that looked like that was an inference from a sort of carving, I think, in a church in the 400s. I mean, really, that there is no great evidence to suggest he was properly crucified. More likely on a T. So they'd rest he would walk along with the top of the T already strapped, and then they'd hoist him up onto the top of the post, and that would be a T, or a pie shape, like the mathematical symbol for pi, a pie shaped one. And basically they reused wood because there wasn't a lot of wood around Jerusalem at the time, and so there are lots of reasons to think that he wouldn't have been able to carry that whole cross himself. So, a lot of the claims in the Gospels just don't add up with what we can generally work out.
Real quick, on that notion, I think it's interesting to let our audience know crucifixion isn't a living person. I'm not saying it isn't this. This is my point. It isn't limited to. Crucifixion is not only, let me take a living person and put them on a pole or on a tree or on a cross type shaped object, whatever, to suffer for days. By the way, it would not have been few hours and then he's dead type of situation. They wanted you to suffer. They wanted you to have agony for days, almost a week. Then let the birds eat you, then let the dogs. But we're going to get into all of that, like why this is all part of the suffering they want you to experience. But oftentimes crucifixion is, you are now dead already, and then they put you up on a stake, on a pole, on a tree to purposely teach the lesson to every bystander that walks by and sees. So this, I guess you'd say, this revealing of a dead body on this, whether there's just disgusting. It's supposed to cause fear in anyone's eyes. Don't do what this guy did. Don't act like this guy. So I wanted to point that out.
Yeah, but here's where it gets a little bit funky, because some skeptics like John Dominic Crossan and Bart Ehrman would say, right, Jesus would be left on the crucifix for days to be picked at by carrion and eaten by, buried in a shallow grave and eaten by wild dogs or whatever. And I initially used to believe this. So I used to think, yeah, that sounds pretty sound, because actually throughout the Roman Empire, that's exactly what happened.
Right.
Until I had long protracted conversations with Richard Carrier about this. And he was absolutely bang on to say this wouldn't have happened in Judea, because they had a localized treaty with the Roman Empire, whereby they were allowed a little bit of elbow room with regard to their sort of customs and rights. And it is very, very overtly stated in rabbinic literature, in all this sort of Jewish law, that if a body has died, if a body is dead, then it should be taken down and buried by sunset. If it's died before sunset, obviously, I don't, if it dies in the middle of the night, there's not much you can do. But the next day you'd be burying it. So whereas the Romans would leave up bodies for 3 days as a deterrent or whatever, and as it's obviously tortured and already dead, but there'd be a long time dying and then leave them up for a long time so that they become a deterrent. That wouldn't have happened with Jesus. I do believe that actually someone would have taken his body down by sunset had they known he had died. So this is where some skeptics would disagree. So I actually disagree with Crossan and Ehrman on account of their claims that he would have been left on a cross. But I don't think he would have been on a cross. Or if it was a cross, it was, as I say, either a T, a pi, or an X shape was more common. The Christian crucifix cross, I don't think we've got any good evidence that he would have been crucified on something like that.
Okay,
but there you go. And the other thing that happens with him is he dies exceptionally quickly. And that's a bit of a problem. Well, it's just weird that he died. Most people, they take some days to die, and then eventually they break their legs if they want to hurry them along, so that their bodies crush their internal organs and they die that way. Or they don't hasten them along, and then eventually your legs give way, because your legs that are sustaining your weight that allows your body to not crush itself. So you basically die of asphyxiation. So what Jesus died within he died within the day. He was like bish bash bosh, died really quickly, and it was all kind of weird. So what's going on there? There's some kind of theological intention that is there some motivation, theological motivation, that they need Jesus to be as intact as possible. They don't need him to be completely, a manky body that is then starting to deteriorate, and then, because it's taken so long to die, and then he's interred in the tomb, and then he resurrects as some kind of zombie, classic sort of zombie looking. Or do they want him to be as perfect as he can be, which means he dies really quickly, gets put in an empty tomb, resurrects, and look,
also,
he's just like he was.
This fulfills the whole non-broken bone prophecies and all of this stuff. So they're purposely avoiding their mimesis connections to the Old Testament to make this something fulfilled, and they're just literally creating a narrative doing such. But that's how it looks, at least.
Yeah, and the other problem that certain skeptics do, and even Christians, I mean, there's a bit of a kind of confusion going on with his death, is that they'll look at people like Philo of Alexandria or this person over here, that person over there, and they'll say, this is what happens and they'll say, look, the emperor's made an exception for someone being taken off the crucifixion, or death structure over here in Egypt. And you're like, yeah, but that's for the emperor's birthday, and that's over there, and it has nothing to do with Judea. So be careful about looking for exceptions of how things happened over here and over there and over there, when you really want to be talking about what happened in Roman-occupied Judea and what was part of the treaty that the Jews had with the Romans, and what would have been the most likely thing to have happened. So I think you get skeptics and Christians alike that make incorrect conclusions by looking at things that happened outside of Judea and are trying to apply that to Judea. My opinion would be that he would have been crucified. In reality, he would have been stoned, left on a piece of wood, and then taken down and then buried in the criminal's graveyard. But if you're a Christian, then or a skeptic that doesn't believe that, then I think to say that he could have been taken down because they took someone down from a cross in Alexandria is don't use that argument.
You go into that. Yeah, everybody needs to get that real quick. Mr. Monster, thank you for the super chat, my friend. Do we truly know if Pontius Pilate existed beyond the Pilate stone, and why was he painted in such a positive light in the New Testament? He was bad. So this is a good question. I especially with the whole Pilate is not a good guy in actual his. So as far as him existing, here we go again, right? Like all we have is the stone, and we have texts, and we have Philo of Alexandria, Josephus. So we have Jewish historians who speak of the guy. Now, if one wants to go off into a conspiracy and act like Philo somehow made this guy up, and the New Testament authors are using Philo, and Josephus is using Philo, and then also you get Roman historians. By the way, the interesting thing about Philo, because people always ask about Jesus, how come no one else wrote about Jesus?
Yeah.
Did you know no Roman historian that we have plenty of Roman historians. None of them speak of Pilate beyond it's outside the first century that you get the first Roman historian who mentions Pilate. Roman. So you have two Jewish historians, but Roman, you don't have that till the beginning of the 2nd century.
But I think so. Richard Carrier's book, Jesus Christ from Outer Space, has a whole section on Jesus versus all these people, because you say that you get some people that claim Jesus has more historical gravitas or more historical sources or evidence for him than Pontius Pilate, Caesar Augustus, Julius Caesar, and they Alexander the Great, and Carrier goes through each of those people and says these are all the sources we have for these people. And this is what we have for Jesus. We have nothing for Jesus apart from the Gospels and all these people. We've got coins, we've got this, we've got that. And he does it for Pontius Pilate as well. So I would say that Pontius Pilate, there is far more credibility for him existing than there is for Jesus existing. So I think I would happily say that Pontius Pilate existed, but I don't think Pontius Pilate, if he did crucify Jesus, he was ruling whilst Jesus was crucified, and either the Jews did it or Pontius Pilate did it for sedition. But it was like 10 a penny. He's like, whatever, I don't care, because he was not a nice guy, and therefore this then feeds back into we know he was not a nice guy, or we're pretty sure he's not a nice guy because of claims that we've got of what he did with clearing up rebellions and what have you. That letting off people like Barabbas for a festivity, which we have no evidence for other than in the Gospels, is something he just wouldn't have done. Yeah, as far as what we know about his character. So I don't know about the Pilate stone in and of itself, but I think generally we can be safe to say that it's safe to say that Pontius Pilate existed. I wouldn't be taking mythicism that far.
Yeah, and if I might just say, adding one thing you brought up, right? He was not a good guy to the Jews, period. Even Romans had problems with him. Like the Romans, according to what we've seen, they're like, man, this guy, he's causing us problems, and he ends up eventually having to be removed. Exactly. Yeah. So this is an interesting point to bring out. We have historians that say bad guy, and then you have Gospels using a most likely, no reason to doubt this guy didn't exist, and made him look like what he was not.
Yeah.
So could the same not be done of a man named Jesus? I asked that, and this guy wasn't even like admired, and Pontius Pilate is made into a good-looking guy. So could the same not be done on Jesus? Ask yourself that question and leave that question in your mind. Those are interesting points to bring up. All right.
Yeah. So and it's there's a little part in here I talk about. So that's like we've just sort of very quickly gone over that Jesus probably wouldn't have been crucified. Definitely wouldn't have been crucified on the Christian style cross, to call it that. I'm pretty sure, and Deuteronomy 21 again, if a man guilty of capital offence is put to death and body hung on a tree. So we definitely as I said, I've given you lots of quotes from different places to say that Jesus wouldn't have been crucified like he was, but maybe he was. But I just don't think that we've got good evidence to suggest he was, because the Gospels are the only sources for these claims.
If you're watching, if you got the book, it's on page 160 that he's quoting from, and he's talking about in his writings. So just a heads up. Go ahead.
Yes. So and then there's a little bit that William Lane Craig sort of again makes some claims. I forget now exactly. I was going to talk about this, but he seems not to understand his own writing. That he gets wrong ideas about what the Jews would allow or not. So he thinks, so this is going on to the next part, which is what I want to talk about, which is Jesus being taken down by sunset. Okay, so I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry, I've got so much to say. So the idea now is that Jesus died, as according to the Christian text, and he's died really, really quickly, but it's before sunset. So we have Joseph of Arimathea that comes along and takes him down. Now, I would agree that a pious Jew, which is what Mark tells us about Joseph of Arimathea, he says as a pious Jew comes and takes down Jesus' body. I believe that that's actually quite probable, which is to say that it's very clearly written in Jewish law that bodies should be taken down by sunset, lest they defile the land. I think we can interpret, and there's some argument to suggest that Joseph of Arimathea in Mark is not a follower of Jesus, and Mark's is the only one that's a kind of neutral on Joseph. It just says he's a pious, he's a pious Jew, and he takes him. We could argue that as a pious Jew, he would take him down from the cross to follow the rules, and then goes and buries him somewhere, and that's the end of Joseph of Arimathea. And the later Gospels embellish Joseph to become this person that actually Mark doesn't necessarily say he was. So I think that's an interesting idea.
I do think it's interesting. Matthew makes him a disciple. Mark doesn't say a damn thing about it. And this goes right into the point we just talked about with Pilate. Like, you got a guy who's faithful Jew who would have been against this Jesus cult most likely as a Sanhedrin, period. I mean, these are guys that are the opponents. And here you have him in Mark. It doesn't say anything like that. He's loyal, faithful. But then Matthew makes him something he's not, just like Pontius Pilate is made something he's not.
Yeah, Mark also doesn't say it's Joseph's own tomb or that it's new. It's never been used before. So Mark doesn't say that. So Mark says very little about this stuff, and everything else appears to be later embellishment. Sorry, I interrupted you. No. Please, this is us, bro. We're collabing. I love this. I want people to go with the whole looking at the synoptic development. You can see a development. Matthew is like, it isn't enough just to have this Sanhedrin member come and bury Jesus. People are already asking questions. Where did he bury him? How do you know? Like, all these things. So they're probably already dealing with people who are naysayers. Because that makes the Jewish look good. That makes the Jews look good, right? Sorry, sorry, it's a bit breaking up there. Probably
it broke up for me too.
Yeah, so this is arguably, Mark's making out Joseph of Arimathea to be like a decent Jew, and of course that they want to be moving away from the Jews being sympathetic to the Jews. So the later gospel authors I could be saying, I mean, this is just my theory I'm throwing out there, could be saying that actually Joseph isn't being nice because he's a pious Jew. He's being nice and taking the body down because he's a secret follower of Jesus. And there's a general just twisting of what they've taken from Mark. And then, in fact, I think Raymond Brown says something. He's a great Catholic exegete that says we should be careful. I'm going to paraphrase him here, but he says we should be careful to take what we think are Mark's intentions from Matthew and Luke, because they change and develop and reinterpret everything they get from Mark so much. Which is a really interesting quote, because it's basically saying that they are just bending and changing Mark for their own theological ends. So that you got one of the greatest exegetes admitting that. But yeah, so I think Mark could be saying something quite different to Matthew and Luke and later John.
I think that it's not a stretch for them to have embellished it, especially when you get to John. You have Nicodemus with him, so now you have another pious Jew who's asking Jesus at night. He comes to him when no one's around, so nobody knows, and he's asking Jesus these questions, and Jesus is teaching this teacher. It's an interesting narrative. So yeah, I think you're right, there's an embellishment going on.
And Deuteronomy, just going to quote Deuteronomy 21. So just to really get in the viewers' minds that bodies would have been taken down early, especially if there was a treaty law with the Romans that the Jews of Judea had. If a man has, and this is Deuteronomy 21, if a man has committed a sin worthy of death and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, again a tree, his corpse shall not hang all night on the tree, but you shall surely bury him on the same day. For he who is hanged is the curse of God, so that you do not defile your land, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. And that's then quoted again in Joshua 8 and Joshua 10. So this is very clear. And in fact, there are many places that say that you should take the body down. You got it in the Mishnah tractates, in the Mishnah Sanhedrin, and Josephus again in Antiquities, and there let him be stoned. And when he is continued there for 1 whole day, and that all the people may see him, let him be buried in the night. He was immediately put to death, and attained no more than to be buried in the night in a disgraceful manner, and such as was suitable as to a condemned malefactor. So that's to say that he would even say bury them in the night. It's that ignominious, it's that obscure a thing that should happen, such a disgrace, that they should be buried in the night, or certainly, buried dishonorably. And we'll come on to that in a second. But the idea is that he would have been taken down before sunset. The issue is just how quickly he died, like the fact that he just never would have died before sunset unless he was really weak. And it's really interesting. I think it was Origen that made an apology for Jesus dying, because he didn't want Jesus to be seen as a weakling. So he said that he had the power to, I can't forget what Origen says, but he kind of like makes an apology for Jesus for dying so quickly. There you go.
Yeah, that's...
But
yeah, that's what happens.
Yeah, and then you've got William Lane Craig, who, this is what I was going to say. So William Lane Craig then says, none of the Gospels suggest that Joseph was acting as a delegate of the Sanhedrin. There was nothing in the law that required that the body to be buried immediately. This is really interesting, because he's wrong. He's just flat out wrong here.
Yeah, he is. And what page are you on?
So I'm on page 164 of my book, and this is from William Lane Craig, something he wrote in 1989.
Got it. I see what you're saying.
And that Jews may have been content to leave that to the Romans. That Joseph dared to go to Pilate and ask specifically for Jesus' body is difficult to understand if he was simply an emissary of the Sanhedrin assigned to dispose of the bodies. So I think Craig's reason for arguing this is because it makes Joseph of Arimathea to be this courageous, Christ-following Jew that he has become in Christian cultural history, as opposed to the much more probable idea that he was merely a pious Jew doing his religious duty, unconcerned with whom Jesus supposedly was. Craig, in arguing for his orthodox Christian view here, is illustrating a dubious methodology whilst contradicting known history. And it's just really surprising, because if Craig knew Jewish law and even the Bible, like, he would know that actually what Craig is claiming is wrong.
He's doing it because he's siding with the church on this. So the church has been early church fathers. They've been making this apologetic claim that this is exactly right. This Jewish Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea was a secret Christian. That way, the Gospels don't look silly as they develop this character. However, what you point out, not only is this Hebrew Bible, you're also pulling sources of how Jews were practicing these things in the first century, and how they would have buried people, exactly what they would have done and what was custom. You quote maybe I'm skipping ahead a little, and I'm not trying to, but you quote another scholar who deals with how burial, like these traditions, they change very slowly over very long periods of time.
Yes.
So the only critique that one might try to make is, well, how come we only have this in the narrative? There's 3 people who are crucified. How come it only tells of Joseph going and getting the one guy named Jesus?
Thank you.
What about
That's my next point.
Right.
That's brilliant. That's perfect. So and
thank you, Zagros. Thank you so much for the super chat, by the way.
This is interesting, because I think it goes both against the general contents of the Gospels, but also the idea that Joseph, as a pious Jew, which I would allow. Joseph, as a pious Jew, comes along and takes Jesus' body down. But as a pious Jew, he should take all of the bodies down. But then you could say, well, the thieves might not have died yet, but there's just no mention of them. But yeah, it is interesting. So maybe it's just that Jesus died so quickly that he goes and does that. But then Michael Alter, who I don't know if you guys remember, but he's written this like 1,000-page tome. he talks about how because what happens is Joseph of Arimathea notices or finds out somehow that Jesus has died. He then goes to Pilate to say, can I take the body down? Again, that would never have happened. Pilate's never going to be worrying about who takes bodies down from execution devices. I mean, come on, he's going to have a centurion for that. I mean, so the whole notion that Joseph of Arimathea is some Christ-supporting Sanhedrin member is going to go and bother Pilate to get some random dude's body taken down. so that he can be buried before sunset or buried honorably somehow, or whatever the reason Joseph has, as the Gospels are trying to communicate, is crazy nonsense. But then Pilate then sends off the centurion to go and confirm that he's died. And so Michael also looks into the timing of this and says, basically, the timing of that makes no sense. There's no way that this would have happened. And it's just quite interesting that I mean, I could bore you, but he's got like a 7-point thing about how the timing for the whole story is just kind of crazy. But it's because I think these gospel writers are writing this many years later, and they're not really bothered about the particular
that's what I was
practical details.
See, some people would try to make a mountain out of this molehill, but the point is, who's the story about? I mean, the two thieves aren't going to be rising from the dead. So it's not like, well, maybe they are. Matthew has the saints, right? Maybe one of them is. I don't know. This day you'll see me in paradise. I'm just being funny when I'm trying to over particular, but the story's about Jesus. So
it's a great point, because that shows a contradiction, because he says, you will see me today, this day. And of course, it's 3 days later, isn't it? Yeah. So there's one of those like weird contradictions that Christians have to go, well, of course, he didn't mean that, or is this
he's in heaven? Yes. But Jesus didn't ascend to his Father, so he was still in the grave. And this is a wonderful point. And one of them, he says, don't touch me. I haven't gone to the Father. I haven't gone up there. I haven't gone up to paradise yet. I haven't ascended. So then what the heck are you doing telling this guy this day you'll be with me in paradise if you didn't go to paradise that day? Well, day doesn't mean day. The interpretations ad infinitum can be used, and we're theologizing how many angels dance on the head of a needle at this point.
Generation doesn't mean generation. Like he was an apocalyptic Jew, and he should have come back to you in your lives, and you're writing gospels that progressively have to explain why the hell he hasn't come back. And there you go.
Yeah, I just want to point that out, because that's the accusation. Well, why don't they mention he takes the other two thieves down if he wasn't a secret follower of Jesus? He's only concerned about Jesus. That's how they'll act like. But it doesn't say that they didn't. It just doesn't mention the other two. They played their part, and here you have Jesus being buried. So anyway.
Yeah. And it's sort of typical like Christian apologetics. I just quote randomly from Jody Magness's "What Did Jesus' Tomb Look Like?" from the burial of Jesus by the Biblical Archaeological Society, right? So this is your typical apologetics. Jesus was condemned by the Roman authorities for crimes against Rome, not by the Sanhedrin (brackets Jewish Council) for violating Jewish law. So already she's like staking a claim here about something that I don't know is pretty controversial. The Romans used crucifixion to maintain peace and order and punish rebellious provincials for incitement to rebellion and acts of treason. Although victims of crucifixion were sometimes left on their crosses for days, this was not usually the case. According to the gospel accounts, Pontius Pilate approved Joseph of Arimathea's request to remove Jesus' body from the cross for burial. Presumably, Joseph had to make this special request because he wanted to ensure that Jesus received a proper burial before the beginning of the Sabbath. And of course, it's just nonsense. It's like, come on, have some critical thinking. Why would Joseph of Arimathea want to have a proper burial for Jesus? Okay, if you believe that he's a secret follower of him, then Pilate's not going to be wanting to allow a proper burial. The Sanhedrin most certainly wouldn't want. They went to a legal ends, if you actually believe the trial claims of the Gospels, to get this guy sentenced to death. They've bent over backwards to make him have a dishonorable end his life as possible, then to go, oh, and by the way, I'm just going to go and bury this guy properly in a tomb. Is that all right? As if all these people are going to go, yeah, that's fine. I love a good criminal honorable burial. Yeah, go for it. Just check around, see what tomb you can find. And it's just absolute nonsense. So it doesn't, as I said there, not only does this not marry with internal biblical claims, it was the Jews who condemned and killed Jesus, but Joseph is arranging an honorable burial going against all sense of the narrative and historical precedents, as we shall now see. So the idea now we get onto is the idea of a dishonorable burial. So we already know that Jesus was the highest form of criminal, so to be afforded the worst death and the worst burial. So what have we got? Some guy, either if you think he's a pious Jew or if you think he's a secret Christ follower, he's taking down a criminal. If he's a pious Jew, he's taking down Jesus' body and he's burying it in his own tomb, arguably, which luckily has no one in it, right? Now, criminals could not be buried next to the righteous, right? Jewish law would have had him buried in the graveyard for the stoned and burned, right?
Yeah, there's two different dishonorable sections you talk about in your book. There's the stone and burned, and then there's another area for other people who died
for beheaded and strangled. And so basically, you have, and in a sense, the Jewish custom didn't like they didn't like even really wicked people being buried next to moderately wicked people, right? So your burial had to be in line with what crime you had, and you definitely couldn't bury a criminal next to the righteous. So this is why you had a criminal's graveyard that allowed you to be buried. And then if you were lucky, your family would, after a year of ritual purification, come and take your bones, and they could reinter you in their family tomb to give you a second burial. Right, but that was only after a year after you'd had sort of purification, in which in that intervening time the flesh would have fallen off the bones, you would have properly decomposed, and you'd be given back the bones, and you go and bury the bones. So there you go. But really you would be buried in a criminal's graveyard. Now, people like John Dominic Crossan would say he was buried in a shallow grave, and there's good evidence to suggest it would be a shallow grave, perhaps somewhere else around Judea in a smaller place, but I don't think a shallow grave is practical in somewhere like Jerusalem, right, where you're going to have an awful lot of criminals being executed and killed. So I think it's far more likely you're going to have some kind of necropolis, whether it's kind of made out of caves or whatever, or actually formally constructed criminals necropolis, where you got these sort of almost mortuary holes where you would put dead bodies in, and then after a year you'd recycle them, give the bones back to families if they came to claim them, or you then just get rid of them into sort of an unknown heap of bones, and then you would take in other criminals and replace the older ones. So some kind of necropolis is almost certainly where Jesus would have been buried, rather than a shallow grave that some skeptics favor.
Right, where the dogs would go and eat and literally just clean up the rotten flesh off the bones. And so it is interesting how they have him in this, and there's people who will want to play in that sandbox and say, okay, if there was a tomb, what can explain what happened? I mean, there's so many levels to this. Some people would not even, they go, all of the tomb narrative is completely legend, right? And then there's some who go, well, no, I think there was definitely a burial in some type of location temporarily, and then it was moved. And if you take, and I speculate here for a second, this is just me completely having fun. Suppose the Sanhedrin member or a group of, few Sanhedrin members have the duty to bury the dead before nightfall for religious purposes. And they go and they bury him in a temporary location. I always make this joke when I tell people, like, I'm having a discussion or like a small, tiny little disagreement, debate type conversation with Christians. It's not probably like Joseph of Arimathea gave a ring. Hey, Mary, Peter. Hey, yeah. Tomorrow morning at 7 a.m., we're moving your Lord. Yeah, it'll be in a new location. It'll be over here, just so you know. And like, he's not ringing them to let them know I'm moving your Lord's body out of my tomb or out of this temporary location till we can get him to a better burial. I'm only speculating here, but I'm just saying, if that were the case, they go, well, why didn't the Sanhedrin just call BS on the Christian movement right out the gate when they started proclaiming that this Christianity is true? And I always said this: what we have is 30 or 40 years later documents about them supposedly screaming from the rooftops about Jesus' resurrection. So if this claim is that Mark's being written in the late 70s, and this happened in the 30s, do you think there's any living Sanhedrin members there to protest and say, no, he was buried down there on West Avenue?
So this is one of the points I make in the book, which is that the gospel writers can make whatever claims they like about the Sanhedrin, because Jerusalem, they're all writing post 70 CE. So Jerusalem has been razed by the Romans. It is destroyed. There are no records. The temple was destroyed. We don't know who was in the Sanhedrin. So you can write Joseph of Arimathea. You can make it up. It doesn't matter. You can say whatever you like happened in 30 whatever CE. You can say whatever you like about Jesus' death. You can say he was buried anywhere you like, because there is absolutely no way of verifying it. Yeah. And it's perfect. It gives you carte blanche to say what the hell you like. And it's just incredibly convenient. So nothing is verifiable. And I think what's interesting, so much to say here. So the women at the tomb, I think, were mechanisms for being witnesses to Jesus being buried in a certain place, so they could go away. They know where he's buried now. So they see Joseph buried. See, one of the arguments, I made this in the previous video, is one of the problems with Joseph of Arimathea being a secret a Christian sect member is that he doesn't appear to be working with any of Jesus's followers, and he's never heard from again. And this is incredibly suspect, because he would surely be working in tandem with all the followers, but there appears to be no connection between them at all. He just takes down the body and then disappears. So he looks like entirely like a mechanism in order to get Jesus' body into a tomb so that Jesus can disappear from the tomb. The women are there as witnesses to that, so they know where the tomb is. And there you go. You could, at a push, say that a pious Jew took his body down, put it in a tomb, because for some reason the criminal's graveyard, although the criminal's graveyard is going to be close to where the executions are, so this is a bit of a stretch. But if you really wanted a tomb to be involved, you could say that a pious Jew took him down, buried it very quickly in a tomb, and then as soon as the festival was over, as Passover was over, came back, took the body out of the tomb and reburied it in a criminal's graveyard. Jesus' followers knew that he was buried in that first initial tomb. Then Joseph or other Jews would come back and take him out of that tomb because it's defiling the righteous burial chamber. They go back to the tomb saying, Jesus was buried here. We saw him buried here. Then they go to anoint his body, to do whatever they were supposed to do, were wanting to do, and he's not there. Right, and out of that, you could have an empty tomb story being born. But even that, I think, that's far more likely than the Christian story. It's way more likely than the Christian story. But I still think it's unlikely that Jesus ever would have been buried in a tomb.
Yeah,
I just wouldn't have been buried with the righteous.
I like to play in the sandbox for fun, just to like show that if I even grant you most of what you are supposing, you're still going to run into some problems. So that was one of the issues I had when I was discussing with a Christian on the phone. I was driving back from New Jersey, and I spent like 3 hours having like a debate discussion saying, all right, I'm just not even going to dispute historical verisimilitude on some of the stuff. And I'll show you that there are still other alternative explanations that could fit the criteria that you couldn't prove aren't true. You couldn't prove that doesn't make sense. And yet you have all this faith in knowing that Jesus rose. I said, at the end of the day, it's going to come down to your subjective experience. And I tried to tell him that he didn't even listen. But then at the end, he started realizing that.
Great segue with the term sandbox. So what I want to bring in here is the secret book of James. So the Apocryphon of James, which is a Christian text written maybe in the late 100s, maybe in the 200s, right? So it's a later written text, but it appears to have no knowledge of the Gospels. So straight away, forget the resurrection account. But here, this is fascinating. So you have Christians who were around at the time who appear not to have read the Gospels. So we get this idea that everyone who was an early Christian knew all the Gospels, and all the Gospel writers knew each other Gospels, and everyone knew everything that was in the Gospels. It's just utter nonsense, and it's evidenced by the non-canonical Gospels. Now, people throw out the non-canonical Gospels as saying, well, these are clearly nonsense, but these are what people believed. You've got to understand that these were written down by actual human beings, right? They're not just sitting there going, do you know what I'm going to do, love, today? I'm going to write a real crazy story, just to write fiction, and we'll have a laugh and we can tell this around the campfire, la 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 la, and they write this fiction. No, they're writing down what they actually believe of Jesus. These are ideas that were prevailing for certain people at a certain time for a certain reason, right? So with the secret book of James, you have this claim in there that he was this is the claim. I'll miss out the first part, but it's nor have you yet been buried in the sand as I was myself by the evil one. So this is what Jesus supposedly said. So in the secret book of James, you have Jesus claiming that he was buried in the sand. Now, we already know that the secret book of James doesn't seem to know what went on in the Gospels. So we have this prevailing idea that Jesus could well have been buried in a shallow grave. Mm-hmm. This could have been an ignominious burial of a criminal in a shallow grave in the sand. And we've got evidence that this might have been believed by people as late as the late 100s and early 200s.
Does Crossan use this passage in his particular claim?
Sorry?
Does Crossan use this passage?
I don't know, actually. That's a good question. I don't know. I'd have to go back. But I just think that the non-canonical text can give you a really interesting insight. And I've come to realize more recently that I need to go and learn an awful lot more about what the non-canonical text said, because although they were kind of crazy and they had like Jesus killing people and you had like the crazy infancy narratives, it's what are they telling you? What do people believe? What are the tussles that were going on theologically between these different groups of nascent Christian sects? I think it's fascinating.
So I got a super chat, and I'd like to hit that and also explain something I think is important because my channel. So Constellation Pegasus, thank you for the super chat. Is it possible the Christian Greeks who wrote the Gospels didn't know Jewish practices? After all, I think he means to say they were written way after the fact. So, what are your thoughts particularly on that?
That's a great question. And I think absolutely. I think there's every reason to suggest that people writing not in the precise area, maybe in diaspora Jewish communities, Hellenized Jewish communities, or in entirely different countries or regions, are writing as people probably brought up within a Hellenized Christian community.
Mm-hmm.
So these aren't like Jews that have converted to Christianity necessarily, and then are writing with a great knowledge of Judaism about how they think Jesus came to, or the received knowledge of Jesus. These are probably people who are born and brought up within nascent Christian societies that are Greek speaking. So they learned their trade of writing through the Greek epics. So you're going to get, as Dennis MacDonald will have, like, mimesis and emulation of Greek sources, are then writing about Jesus without necessarily being total Jews, like knowing loads about Jewish culture and Jewish law. So that they make mistakes, and we know that Mark makes mistakes and is corrected later by Matthew and Luke and so on and so forth. So we know that they don't have perfect Jewish knowledge, and I think that's a great question that I think we've got good evidence to suggest that they didn't know their Jewish customs particularly well or perfectly.
Thank you for the super chat. Endo, thanks for the compliment on the dope hat. I appreciate it. It's
definitely talking about me. He's definitely talking about me. 100%.
Goku, I think he's definitely talking about you. He's definitely not talking about me. Now, one of the things that I want to do.
Never called my hats dope.
I have to say this because I am MythVision, right? So a lot of people who watch the channel, like I've got my friend here, Johnny Rochester here, and I hope I'm saying your name right, my friend. But most of these guys who come in are mythicists. I was a mythicist. I'm not a mythicist now. But that doesn't mean it's not possible. I'm just saying, I definitely think there was a guy at the base. And then what I've noticed is there's this expectation of prove he exists first, as I've seen Johnny mention here. Prove he exists first before we even talk about anything. And at that point, you're not really even engaging with the material. You're just kind of saying all of that's embellished. All of that is fiction. Here's what we're doing. When you do this historical investigation, we're looking at how was the burial practices actually practiced in this time? Is there potentially a memory? Is there something at the base? Because, for example, if you're going to say he didn't exist, right, at all, we're trying to hypothesize in the mythicist camp, like, what best explains this data? Was he really buried and crucified and manufactured or born in heaven, and all this stuff's taking place in outer space? I've read Carrier. I've read his books, both of the books that deal with this in particular. And so when you do that, you're still trying to engage with material. And for me, there's not enough of that heavenly outer space situation happening for me to say all this just happened otherworldly, outside of what happens on the ground in this world. And so I'm just putting the point out there that we're definitely agreeing this is embellished, and we don't know what actually happened. We're literally just showing, based on documentation, when you look back then, how did they bury criminals? What would have happened if Jesus actually was crucified and this did happen? That gives more of a historical verisimilitude rather than just going, he didn't exist. Because then you have those questions like we've heard earlier. Did Pontius Pilate exist? I mean, after a while, it's like, does anyone exist unless you have empirical, physical, archaeological evidence? And people exist.
Claim is a general philosophy here. Every claim is a probability claim, really, when you're talking about this kind of stuff. So cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. The only thing you can prove indubitably that exists is yourself. Your thinking entity. So the thinking entity that can be skeptical of existing has to exist, right? After that, everything's a probability. So when you're saying, did Jesus exist? That's just a probability. We can't prove he exists. It's just a probability. Carrier reckons that 67.33% that he didn't exist. I am 67.33% he did exist, but I'm not going to die on that hill, like I keep saying.
Right.
But like you say, we'll piece this jigsaw together of like, what do we know about burials and what do we know, and then about the fact that there are these claims, there are these Christian sects, there is this idea, and I would side with Bart Ehrman on the fact that there are gist memories, that there are just these little nuggets of like Jesus of Nazareth was a miracle worker, like an itinerant preacher, and he went to Jerusalem and he got executed, and pretty much that's all you can know. Like I think that there's your history. Everything else is myth. Everything else is embellishment.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, though, then why do you even believe him? There's no people who are out here contemporary to him that are writing about him other than Paul. Paul has a heavenly Christ, et cetera, et cetera. So the list goes on. And I'm not going to sit here and postulate that position either. I'm not going to sit here and push that. People exist. I said this earlier in the show. 99% of people or more existed, and we have no documentation of them. We are like no documentation, and especially physical evidence to know that they exist. So when we talk about physical evidence, it's a whole nother thing. I mean, we're dealing with it. So I don't need to go full on mythicist in order to sit here and talk about these things.
But actually, what someone like Carrier, who's a mythicist, and I consulted with him a lot on this book, and this is he 100% agrees with this whole burial chapter and everything within it, because irrespective of whether you think Jesus is a myth or not, these arguments still pertain to
against the gospel
claims. Yeah. And so you know, it doesn't matter whether you're a historicist or a mythicist. These aim to show that Jesus wasn't buried in the way that was claimed. He either didn't exist or wasn't buried like that. But the Gospels are wrong either way.
I guess my whole point in even bringing this up was simply this: when we're doing what we're doing today, and we're having these discussions, I get it. You would go, well, prove Jesus exists. I would say put that on the shelf, because that's a question I don't even think is necessary when we're dealing with this criteria here. We're simply looking at what history is and using the Gospels as data to try and say, would that even be possible historically? Does that even make sense in real history? If this went down, what are the problems with this? And so at the end of the day, you can believe whatever you want. You can say, nope, there wasn't a guy, or yep, there was probably a guy, but he wasn't a miracle worker who actually did these things and actually walked on water, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway.
The Apocryphon James, or some people translate that buried in the sand, but you know the thing I mentioned about him being buried in the sand as translated as the last line is saying, nor have you yet been buried shamefully, as I myself was by the evil one. So some translations say buried shamefully, which is again fits well into what we're trying to say here. Josephus again states in Antiquities of the Jews, he that blasphemeth God, let him be stoned and let him hang upon a tree all that day, and then let him be buried in an ignominious and obscure manner. And that's really important. So not only are you going to be stoned and hung on a tree, but you're going to be buried ignominiously and obscurely. And some might even be at night, but certainly as what that means is you're going to be buried along with a load of other criminals. That's the obscurely, as in you know, you won't know the person who keeps the ledger might know where exactly you're buried, but no one else is going to know where you're buried, and it's going to be dishonorable. And that is evidence from all the Jewish law that we know, and from Josephus and all these other sources. So we are fairly sure that he would have received a dishonorable burial.
I think in your book too, what you point out about this burial thing is John Dominic Crossan and others who say he'd been up for days. What you go to show is that was the practice of the Romans, but being that Roman is this, they're ruled. They have their appointed leaders that are Jewish. They give them that. They grant them that. In fact, in your chapter, what I found fascinating is one of those things where you're like, I think it was Vespasian, Titus, I can't remember, but there was this like point. He was like, why are you guys doing this? We've given you your own control of your own region. We allowed you to practice your laws. Maybe we're going to get to that. Am I already skipping? I don't want to skip.
No. I mean, something we've already talked about a little bit before, which is they had a treaty with the Romans, but yeah.
Right. And let me just finish this point, because this is fascinating. You point out in your book is that he's like, we gave you your laws. We let you do your laws. Right. So in Josephus, it's clear that the Romans are like, why are you rebelling and causing these problems and fighting us? We're like, the other nations probably didn't grant these things, and we did. We're letting you have your own leaders who are your own religious leadership, and you have your own practices, your own temple, your own religious rites, which is saying, like, look, you can follow your burial customs. We're not going to fight you on keeping the body up on this cross for 3 to 5 days or whatever. We're going to allow you to, for religious purposes, to bury your dead. And the Jews within their own bubble would never have like put him in some pretty nice honorable burial. They would have stuck him in this other dishonorable burial location, and that would have been what history would have presented.
That was Josephus quoting Titus. So from the Wars of the Jews. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. And we have, what other evidence do we have? Well, the Hebrew Bible itself says in 1 Kings 13. That's a bit Trumpy in there. Jeremiah 22 that criminals would be blasphemous criminals would get dishonorable burial. Jewish historian Josephus recounts a biblical story from Joshua 7 that ends straight away put to death, and at nightfall was given the ignominious burial proper to the condemned. So there is no doubt that Jesus should have had an ignominious burial. So if you're going to somehow claim that he didn't, this is going to be highly, highly improbable. And it's going to be a stretch to show how any Jew would allow that to take place.
Yeah, it really is. Eric, my friend in Peru, thank you so much for the super chat. He's asking a question about Nazareth. It's a little bit off topic, but it's still in the vein of like dealing with a historical place here. Nazareth wasn't mentioned in the Old Testament, neither in the Talmud. Paul nor Josephus mentioned it. Where did the authors of the Gospels take this name from? And when Nazareth became a real city? Gracias, bro. Gracias.
So that is, I'll tell you what, we'll get on to talking about that when we do our nativity, the book that I've written on nativity. But I've also written articles on that and the Nazarene that I can maybe link to you, because that's a big old long analysis to talk about what's really being meant by Nazarene. Is it someone from Nazareth, and does Nazareth exist? And René Salm wrote the book Myth and Nazareth. I mean, some people are pretty skeptical about some of his claims, but the idea is that we don't really have evidence for it past before 70, I think, CE or whatever. So but that is pretty off topic, and that to answer that properly would take me about 20 minutes.
Okay, Eric, dude, you got me on Messenger. We'll make sure we ask him. Thank you for the super chat, my friend.
So here's a quote. There's a great Christian, a Christian called Byron McCain, who wrote a really good article where no one had yet been laid the shame of Jesus' burial. So as a Christian, he believes Jesus was given a dishonorable burial, although I think he argues for a tomb. But he states in one place, the element of shame in Jewish dishonorable burial is most vividly evident in the specific differences between burial in shame and burial with honor. Honorable burial emphasized precisely what shameful burial left out: the family tomb and mourning. So we get on to not only is the place dishonorable, but you were also not allowed rites and mourning, right? So the idea that the women then come to the tomb and do all this stuff for a criminal is just, it wouldn't have happened. Not only wouldn't they wouldn't have known where he's buried, or he would have been in a criminal's necropolis, but they would not have been permitted to mourn. And particularly on festival days. So
it is a very interesting point you bring up. I have to bring this up because I've got 18 or 19 videos I did with Del C. Allison Jr. And one of his arguments was that he thinks that there's a historical kernel to women going to the tomb to try and anoint the body. And then he makes this argument because he's starting with the earliest source, 1 Corinthians 15, with Paul and all these appearances. And he's like, well, they didn't mention, the reason Mary isn't mentioned here is because they're androcentric. They're all focused on men. It's kind of a, it's a patriarchal movement. So they wouldn't have mentioned her. And I thought to myself, okay, hold on. And then he goes, but the Gospels, they wouldn't have said this. He then does the apologist argument right after he does that and goes, well, the Gospels wouldn't have mentioned women going to the tomb. Because that would have been embarrassment. And this is a criteria of embarrassment that the apologists love to point out, because women have no, they wouldn't have done that. And I thought to myself, hold on. Mark is Pauline. This guy's androcentric, and other scholars point out he's androcentric. So why does he have women go to the tomb? It makes zero sense.
So we'll talk about this in a later video, because chapter 16, which you haven't got to in the book yet, is the woman at the tomb. Who were they? Which is looking at the common apologetic claim that it's embarrassment, the testimony, they wouldn't have used women because it's embarrassing to use women, and they can't use women, and you get different versions of this. It's not legal, but the idea is that because they use women and it would be embarrassing to use women as testimony, it therefore must be true. But I do go to town on that. And
I was just going to say in that, because we're going to dwell on that. In that is that you point out in your book, there's reference in the Hebrew Bible where they would not have been allowed to do this. So what makes more sense? They're actually doing what they legally aren't, according to Jewish custom and law, do. Or I like to think there's Greek influence in some way here. So like we talked about with Dennis McDonald, why are women showing up to the tomb? Well, there might be some narrative reasons as to why you're having this happen. And we'll get into that, I'm sure, later. But Jewish customs would have said, no, Oh, he's grabbing a book, I think. Uh-oh. You're muted.
Dennis McDonald's book, Homeric Epics and the Gospel of Mark, talks exactly about that and about the mimesis. In fact, I've just written an article on my blog, one of the latest articles, about 3 articles ago. It was only came out this morning. Is about the connection between the Homeric Epics and Joseph of Arimathea and the woman at the tomb. So there are 3 women, and there are 3 women with Priam and Hector and etc. etc. So there are arguments to say that it is an emulation of Homer.
Yeah, I'm going to pop that up here, show everybody real quick. This is his blog. If you don't know, it is pathos.com. And then, so of course,
that third one down there, Mark and Homeric emulation.
Okay, I'm gonna post that in the chat so everybody can check that out. So whenever they get the chance. But yeah, sorry. I had, we're having fun along the way, just pointing out some stuff. I posted it now. Okay.
Yeah, nice one. Thanks for that. So just going back to burial customs, I just want to slam home some of the sources telling us. So this is the Mishnah Sanhedrin. So again, Jewish law from oral tradition. They did not bury the condemned in the burial grounds of his ancestors, but there were 2 graveyards made ready for the use of the court. One for those who were beheaded and strangled, and one for those who were stoned and burned. That's what we talked about earlier. So he would have been buried in the stoned and burned graveyard for the stoned and burned. Talmud Sanhedrin states, and just as a wicked person is not buried beside a righteous one, so a grossly wicked person not to be buried beside one moderately wicked. So it's this idea that even they're separating the proper nasty people from the slightly nasty people. And that this is from the Midrash Rabbah. Those slain by a court of law are not buried in their father's sepulchres, but in a grave by themselves. And then, so on and so forth. So the idea of indignity in burial is hugely important. Jesus wouldn't have been given an honorable burial. That's the takeaway.
Wow. Which, in effect, since we're going down this, and he would have been given a dishonorable burial, how does that impact us? We've touched about some of these details, but since it would have been a dishonorable burial, what would the results have been instead of what we see? So what are some of the problems with the Gospels if that's the case? Well,
he would have been executed and buried. I'm fairly sure that you would be executing people near where they're going to be buried, right? So it seems to me rather improbable that you would have to take someone down and then tramp, a couple of miles to go somewhere else to go and bury them. They're going to be taken down from there and buried in the criminal's graveyard. So I don't think that the idea that he would have been put in a tomb just until they had time to then go and bury him in a criminal's graveyard. I think it's more likely than Christian story, as I said, but less likely than what would have happened, he would have been killed, stoned, hung up, buried in a criminal's graveyard. There you go, end of. And then in a year's time, his family might have been would have been allowed to take his bones to then rebury him in a tomb in a family tomb if they so wanted. Some people might argue, well, could they make exceptions here? But actually, it's pretty. We've got some Roman law, the digester, that it does come a bit later, but it refers to earlier law that says the bodies of those who are condemned to death should not be refused their relatives, which is to say relatives should be allowed to get hold of their bodies eventually. And it goes on to say, at present, the bodies of those who have been punished are only buried when this has been requested and permission granted. And sometimes it is not permitted, especially where persons have been convicted of high treason. Right. So it's saying that you cannot give permission. There are no exceptions for people who have been buried for high treason, who have been executed for high treason, which Jesus arguably was. So it's like there seems to be very little wriggle room for allowing Jesus off the hook here as far as receiving an honourable burial.
On top of that, if you combine what you're saying about this in Roman law and the Jewish custom of an unclean body, there's a combination of things going on here. But this is obviously, I think it's all, there's this fictional element completely running through this because they want him to resurrect. The idea is that he's going to live again. So they have this honorable approach to show that, oh, he's alive. So by the time they're written, this is a sold, we see it in Paul, but it's like, this is the gospel, you know, like, so whatever you're going to write, it needs to match that Jesus rose from the dead. And that's exactly the purpose of the authors of the Gospels.
Yeah. So everything becomes a mechanism really to get Jesus to be able to rise from the death, from death. And so, you know, empty tombs and this and that, and Joseph of Arimathea and the woman at the tomb, and all these are just mechanisms to allow the eventual, you know, objective to take place. I go on to say we return to the idea that Jesus was particularly toxic and people went utterly out of their way to get him crucified. The likelihood of going back on their decision to treat him ignominiously, but to give him honor in death, is preposterous. There is no precedence for someone in the same situation as Jesus being given an honorable burial. There's no precedence. So, some people use, so this is a really common one, and a lot of your viewers will know this. So they're the bones of Jehohanan. So there was an ossuary that was discovered in modern archaeology where they found the heel bones of someone with a nail fused to them, right? And Christians got onto this, say, look, this was found in a tomb. This is evidence that Jesus could be buried honorably because we've got a criminal honorably buried in a tomb within an ossuary. And it's like, no, this fits exactly with Jewish law, which is to say, you wait a year until the flesh has fallen off those bones, and then you go as a family member and you reclaim those bones and you put them in an ossuary and you then rebury them in a tomb.
I love it.
And not only that, but we know that's the case because you couldn't get the nail out of the heel bone. Why not? Because it fused. Why? Because it already been sitting in a loculus in a like where the bones would have been buried as a criminal for a year. So as a year, an iron nail does what an iron nail does, and it fuses to the bone. Right? It doesn't fuse to the bone after being hung up for like 2 days or a day. Right, or 3 days. It fuses to the bone when it's been left in a damp place for a year, and then is reburied. And then they can't get the nail out, so they just put the whole lot in an ossuary, whack it in their family tomb, and rebury him. This isn't evidence of a honourable burial for a criminal. This is absolute evidence for the second burial of bones that a family will reclaim from a necropolis and then bury in their family tomb once it's gone through ritual purification. End of. So I don't want to hear that one used again by Christians.
Yeah, and you bring up one where a guy actually spends the money to buy, I think to have someone take it down from a cross or something. Like they spent a lot of money from a crucified situation. Isn't that one that you mentioned? What page are you on, by the way?
I don't know. I'm flipping all over the place. I'm 176. So there are exceptions that people will throw out, but they never really quite, as I say, they don't really marry up. I'm not quite sure what you're talking about.
So yeah. We know in Egypt, page 177, we know in Egypt that Jewish philosopher Philo talks about someone being taken off the cross, as quoted earlier, on the emperor's birthday. So that's actually a different example.
That's what I said earlier about you could take people down off crosses early, but that was an example of the emperor's birthday. You can take him down off the cross, but this is in Alexandria. This is in Egypt, right? So this is a completely different context. and it's for a completely different reason. And it's not, but what people do is they try and apply that to Jesus to say, look, Jesus could be taken down early. Whereas actually all you need to say is they're following Jewish law, and the Jews had a treaty with Rome within the Jerusalem area. That's all you need to say.
Yeah, I thought somebody spent the money on one, but I can't remember if you
Yeah,
said
there
that.
probably is. I mean, I've got MS, right? So my memory, I have to reread this chapter to remember what I wrote, and I only wrote this book relatively recently, so my memory is shocking. So I do apologize.
So there's one that says we also know that Cicero mentions in 70 BCE a governor in Sicily who released bodies to family members for a fee, but again, that is not Judea, and we know that Jesus' family didn't feature in his burial. So I like to pretend to be an apologist. I'm devil's advocate, right? I like to go back and forth in my head. And I said, they do make this interesting claim that Joseph of Arimathea is like this rich guy, right? So they don't say this in Mark, but it's like, I'm playing the apologist here. But Derek, he paid a fee to Pontius Pilate, if you grant all that, to get the body of Jesus down, because he's a rich guy and he's a follower of Jesus. Like, you can go on and create these scenarios where
and of course he's a rich guy because that fulfills the prophecy, as we talked about in the prophecy video. Yeah. So that's why he's a rich guy. There's no reason for writing rich or prominent. It depends, how you translate it. But it just it's about fulfilling those prophecies, isn't it? So then we get onto this idea. So he wouldn't have been honorably buried. But according to the Gospels, some guy did take his body down, but then put him in a tomb that he just luckily had, right? And then we have the woman at the tomb, and then we have all the stuff that happens afterwards. First thing to say about that is we talk about rolling the stone away. It turns out that there are no disc-shaped stones for tombs that were found at the time frame that was required for Jesus' tomb. It's more likely a rectangular shape, what they call cork-shaped, even though corks for us aren't really rectangular. But cork-shaped, a rectangular stone would have been there, and that's probably what angels would find it easier to sit on. Turns out there's only, I think, 4 disc-shaped stones being found, and they've been for tombs of the exceptionally wealthy, and they come much later. So there's a bit of a problem there. But we have Jesus being buried in this tomb. And then we have the woman going there, and we'll talk about the woman in far more detail about the anointing and the problems with that in a future one. But the idea that they would be allowed to go and continue the burial rites is just, again, against Jewish law. There's just no way that should have, we've got a Mishnah passage stating a mourner must not observe mourning on festivals. This was a festival, for it is written, and thou shalt rejoice on thy rejoice on thy feast. So in other words, you shouldn't be mourning, you should be rejoicing. As I say, there is scholarly agreement that dishonorable burials disallowed for public mourning in Jewish jurisprudence and ritual. As Jeremiah 22:18 stipulates, they shall not lament for him. The Talmud further verifies this opinion with, for those executed by the court, no rights whatsoever should be observed. And the Mishnah Sanhedrin 6:6 also includes, and they used to not make open lamentation, but they went mourning, for mourning has its place in the heart. So in other words, you were supposed to do it inside rather than openly mourning. So there are loads of sources to say that the woman shouldn't have been doing anything like this, fulfilling any of the normal sort of burial rites, because this is a criminal burial and he should have been buried ignominiously. So therefore, what were the women doing there? It's kind of bonkers.
Yeah, it's part of the narrative. The only other an apologist might try to say, well, they didn't see him as guilty or some crap, but that would be like acting like they're willing to ignore the law, right?
Yeah.
Here in this particular situation, and that's also silly. I mean, in I think it's in Deuteronomy you quote, but they're not even supposed to cry like outwardly. Yeah. They're not even supposed to show signs of like tears and things like that for this person, and Jesus fits that criteria of that kind of death. But of course, the Gospels don't paint.
I think the women here are just, as again we'll say in the later video, they are just mechanisms. They are mechanisms for a host of reasons, but primarily here to observe where Jesus was buried, so that there could be some kind of verifying that there's an empty tomb. because this is what the later gospel writers particularly wanted, which is proof that there's the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and we've got this from evidence of these people, except all the women, the claims of who the first people there are different in every gospel. No one can agree on who the women were.
Yeah.
So on and so forth. Dennis MacDonald, actually, page 74 of that book, says this is an interesting quote. Two difficulties internal to Mark's story, however, suggest that this setting is not so innocent. Joseph himself seems to have rolled the stone against the door, even though, quote, it was very large. But the three women who arrived Easter morning were unable to move it. Of course, Mark may have wanted his reader to assume that Joseph, a dignitary, employed help in moving the stone. Even so, and this is the second problem, the woman who had seen, quote, where the body was laid, end quote, should have brought help to the tomb. Instead, they arrived wringing their hands and asking each other, quote, who will roll the stone away the stone from the entrance to the tomb, close quote. These difficulties may have derived from Mark's use of Homer, so he explains that in the context of Homer. But the sense of this is nuts, which is they're going to a tomb to anoint Jesus' body or do whatever they wanted to do with it, and there's a massive stone there. And they're not prepared. And they're like, how are we going to get this stone out of the way? Oh, it turns out that angels have done it. Isn't that lucky?
Bart Ehrman actually came out finally by going, like, it was a few years back, of course. I think Dr. Price was talking about this, where he used to think that this was still historical, like that there was a tomb and there was something there. He has completely reneged that. I mean, this guy is not thinking that at all. He's like, these are legendary at this point. That's what he now says.
I don't think you can get well. I think, and that is a really interesting point, because Bart Ehrman's actually someone whom I respect quite a lot. I know the whole Carrier. I also respect Richard Carrier, and I know there's that kind of Ehrman Carrier. But some of Bart Ehrman's books are really very good, as equally Carrier's are. And so I do respect him, and the fact that he's changed his opinion, it's always people changing their opinions is always a worthy thing. I did that several times for this book in this chapter. Actually, I used to think, as I said, the body would have been left up to be pecked at. I changed my mind on that. I've changed my mind on a few things as a result of researching this book, and I think that's worthy because it's following the evidence, and it's worth taking note of why they change their evidence, especially if there's someone you respect.
Yeah. And I mean, he's very conservative in some respects for a lot of critical people think he's very conservative. And then others think he's too liberal. If you go toward the apologist side, of course, he's way too critical, way too liberal.
Someone that annoys both sides is often, probably correct.
Or close to something.
Closer,
in the gray area.
Who knows? So I think I don't know that I've got too much more to say. I mean, I do say an awful lot more in the chapter. This is a packed chapter.
Yeah, that
is full of loads of sources and references because it's going back into history and Jewish law. But all that we do need to say is that Jesus never would have been sentenced in the way he was. So the whole trial was a complete nonsense. He never would have been executed in the way he was. The way it's described in the Gospels is complete nonsense. He never would have been buried in the way he was. That's complete nonsense as well. There's nothing that the Gospels get remotely right or possibly right about Jesus' death and burial.
Yeah, that tells me it's purposeful. The entire intention there is purposeful. I'll read your concluding remarks in this chapter, and you say it is worthwhile, while quickly drawing together some conclusions here for ease of reading, I will bullet point these. Number one, I don't think this likely happened on the Passover week. This is a theological contrivance, or just before Sabbath. 2, the Christian could argue that Mark is recounting a dishonorable burial in a criminal's graveyard, and that the later Gospels are correcting the narrative and putting more meat on the bones. Yes, pun intended. 3, I personally don't think Mark is recounting this, as, for example, the tomb appears not to be the complex one would expect. And with Joseph doing the spade work, the later Gospels are still greatly embellishing Mark's lack of details. 4, Jesus was probably stoned, not on marijuana, and then hung or displayed and taken down by sunset when he died. 5, if he was crucified, it almost certainly wasn't on a cross, as you imagine, Christian crosses. 6, Pilate was unlikely involved. 7, his followers were unlikely there, and not close if they were. And witnesses were only used as mechanisms for an empty tomb narrative. and to contrive certain supposed evidence and sayings. 8, Jesus would not have died so quickly. And then 9, Jesus was almost certainly buried dishonorably. There is a possibility his body was stored temporarily and then later moved to a criminal's graveyard. But yeah, the probability on that one, you're saying, now let's say he was buried dishonorably out the gate.
There is a section I have in here about compounding probabilities, and I just want to say something about that quickly. So these are when you have, and this only works for claims that are dependent on each other, but when you have like a list of 10 claims and you say this first claim has got a 10% chance of it happening, and then the second claim, which depends on the first claim, has like a 5% chance of it happening, and then the third claim has a 10% chance, and the fourth claim a 6% chance, and the seventh one a 2% chance. And you might look at all these claims and say, what's the chance of this of all of this happening? And you might say, well, the lowest one is 2%, so it's a 2% claim. No, it's 5% of 10%, which is a fraction of 10%. So you're dividing 10% by 20. And then the next one, so if you go from 10, 5, and then the next one's 10%, it's 10% of that fraction. So each percentage, if all of these depend on each other, each percentage compounds the previous overall percentage. So at the end, rather than being the lowest percentage of all those 10, which is 2%, it's actually like 0.0000002% chance of this happening, because you're compounding the probabilities each time, the percentage calculations each time. It's a compound calculation. So actually, if you have if you want to believe all of these things to have happened, and this gets you to this end result, then actually you're believing things that are really, really, really improbable.
So I guess we could turn this over to Q&A. And if you guys want to ask any questions, feel free. I'll pop them up. We always appreciate super chats, of course. That's what keeps the lights on, too. But I see a few that I find interesting, and we can take these and then we'll close out here. So first question I thought was interesting was Joyce. And she says, why wouldn't Jesus die quickly? He was beaten first, then hung. Now, in Mark, how much detail does Mark give pertaining to what happens prior to the cross? We know he's crowned with thorns. We know that they parted his garments. Now, I'm not saying that historically. I'm saying according to the narrative. So how much, according to Mark's narrative, is he taking a beating on that is so much so that he dies so quickly that even Pontius Pilate is shocked? I mean, if he's the guy who's giving these beatings, why would he be shocked after he just saw supposedly what happened to Jesus? I'm being a critic here, and I'm doing like a little bit of investigative work.
Yeah,
he shouldn't be like, he's dead already. Well, we only did everything that Mel Gibson's going to predict in 2,000 years happened to him on his TV show. Why is he dead? I mean, he wouldn't have been shocked. I think he'd have been like, well, yeah, we did kick his ass pretty bad there. Yeah. Just go get him down. No, he's shocked that he's dead, it seems. So,
do you know what? He could have died early. I mean, it's just, he could have, there's nothing, he might have been weak, as an actual human being, he might have been weak and had a weak heart or weak rib cage or whatever, and could have died quickly. Yeah, it's not unrealistic. But when you're putting all of these probabilities together, okay, most criminals took days to die. Most people took days to die. And then they had to hurry them along or they didn't have to, but they often hurried them along by breaking their legs, for example. But here we say they didn't break their legs. Oh, why is that? They pierced his side. So you've got these weird situations where the Gospel of John says purposefully they didn't break his legs because that fulfilled the scripture, because he's a Paschal lamb. You can't break the legs of a Paschal lamb for your Passover Seder. So Jesus is the Passover Seder, atoning for sins, blah, 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 or celebrating the Passover. So they don't break his legs, and then they pierce him after he's already dead. Although if you look at some of Matthew's claims like that, there's a hidden missing part of Matthew that's in some of the earliest ones, which it happens before he dies. In John, it happens after he dies. So there's some contradiction there. But they pierce his side, and then water and blood flows out. So that's a weird theology. The whole thing's theological. I mean, the whole thing is theological. These guys are delivering theology, not history, lads. I keep saying theology, not history. So, yeah, it could have happened, but none of this is likely. The whole thing is incredibly unlikely from start to finish. From the Last Supper, from there to his burial and to the Ascension. all of this is just nonsensical and incoherent or contradictory or whatever. It's just, yeah.
Okay. Doc Pleroma, thank you for asking this question. Why wouldn't Pilate be involved? And this is an interesting thing about your book, that you take a stance I've never really thought about. Pontius Pilate isn't involved. And he says he almost certainly was involved and condemned the zealot movement as seditious. So, so there's that little caveat of like.
So it depends. Yeah, no, that's a good question. And that's totally fair. It depends what your theory of why Jesus was executed. So if he is executed for sedition, then yes, Pilate would have been involved. But if he's executed for blasphemy, and this was a Jewish thing, if you're going to believe the Gospels, that this was an upstart guy that was annoying the Jewish high priest, then Pilate's not going to be bothered about that. And he's certainly not going to be bothered by some random dude asking if he can take a body down when this will be literally the busiest part of the year. I mean, okay, this is where I will refer back. I said I wasn't going to read it out, but here should give you a little indication of why it would be unlikely that Pilate was going to get involved. So this is to do with the timing of Joseph going to
get the body or ask Pilate.
So this is what Michael also says. In an analysis of the timeline, presents other problems. Numerous events are needed to transpire during the time between Jesus' death and Joseph's appeal to Pilate. These include the following. 1. Jesus' death needed to be confirmed by those present at the crucifixion site. 2. Joseph needed to receive corroborating information about the death of Jesus. It would take time for this information to reach him. I mean, Joseph's not going to be standing underneath the cross, one presumes. The Gospels do not identify the location of Joseph upon his receiving this information. He could have been at home, at the temple, at the gathering place of the Sanhedrin, in the court, or somewhere in the city. 3. Joseph needed to prepare himself to see Pilate. 4. Joseph needed to travel to Pilate's locale, make a request to see the procurator, wait for an audience to see him, have a conversation with Pilate, and receive permission for his request. 5. Pilate would probably have had additional time constraints. The city was filled with thousands of pilgrims in celebration of the coming Sabbath and the Passover festival. According to Jeremiah, 1975, page 375, during Jesus' life, Jerusalem had from 25,000 to 30,000 inhabitants. 180,000 celebrants participated at Passover. So Jerusalem is just met with an influx of people. What's Pilate going to be worrying about, right?
Rebellions and riots and
not about whether some guy can take some bloke's body down from a crucifix. So consequentially, numerous logistical issues would be his primary focus. At the least, security matters would be a concern for the Roman authorities. Passover was a time at which Jews remembered their salvation by God from subjugation of the Egyptians. The Passover feast was represented a potential silent protest against the Roman Empire's presence in the Holy Land. Number 6, Pilate needed to summon a centurion to verify that Jesus was already dead. The centurion had to travel to the site of Jesus' crucifixion and confirm the death. The centurion needed to travel back to Pilate's residence, and then Pilate had to question the centurion. Finally, Joseph needed to be summoned again to Pilate to receive permission to take custody of Jesus' body. Do you see what I mean? So it's about when you start looking at practicalities of the stuff here, you're like, actually, when I think about what has to happen, it's really easy for a gospel writer to say, oh, yeah, Joseph went to Pilate and asked to take down a body. Centurion confirmed that, and then that's like half a day's worth of stuff has to happen at the most busy time in Pilate's complete rule.
Right.
Just,
we haven't even brought up the juggling between Pilate, Herod, and then back to Pilate scenario too. There's so many unlikely fictional additives to this whole thing that just makes it, I mean, like just all of that happening in one day. You need 3 days in one day to make all this stuff happen. And I just don't see how that happened.
Yeah. And you've got to remember that Jews, if this is Passover, it depends which gospel you believe. But if this is actually Passover, then you can't be out while it's dark. And you're going to be observing the really tight Jewish law around Passover. But the question goes back to the idea of so some skeptics will say actually he was crucified for sedition. That's fair enough. It could be a possibility from a skeptical point of view, but it's certainly not what the Gospels say, and they're pinning it firmly on the Jews. So yes, Pilate would be involved, but you have to be throwing out all the Gospels in order to say he was executed for sedition. That could have happened, and then the Romans were involved.
Interesting. Okay. Question
Good
from
question,
Jojo.
man.
Yeah, Jesus was a Jewish rabbi. We need to have accounts of him, right? Do we have accounts of other people of that time?
Good question. I mean, we have reference to other sort of Jewish cultic leaders, Simon Bar Kokhba and all these other ones. So there are, and Josephus does give us accounts. There are no accounts of Jesus. The question should be, I suppose, should we expect accounts of Jesus? So it's the argument from silence. So the idea that we talked about this earlier in previous video, which is we would expect Paul to mention certain things about Jesus. He doesn't mention certain things about Jesus. When there's silence and you should expect there to be evidence, then it means something's going on. So in that case, Paul probably didn't know the empty tomb thesis or the empty tomb events or the claims about the empty tomb. In Matthew's zombies and earthquake and ripping of the veil, why is there no evidence? Why is there silence? Because it never happened, right? This is evidence that it didn't happen. With Jesus, would we expect there to be accounts of his life? I don't know. Maybe you could imagine that there could be. I mean, you do get him mentioned in Josephus, but then there are theories of interpolation. I find it far more problematic that you've got, so it's going slightly off because it's not to do with the resurrection per se, although we've got the appearance narratives. If he genuinely appeared to 500 people, if he genuinely fed 4,000 or 5,000 people, you would expect there to be some kind of evidence other than some Gospels written 40 to 80 years later. So that's, I think, in a sense, yes, we should expect to have accounts of him, and we don't. But I would expect accounts of the miracle. I'd expect some evidence, like if he had genuinely just fed 5,000 people, they'd be going around and like telling everyone. This would be like hot news, right? If he genuinely like resurrected Lazarus to life, then everyone would be like, man, this is nuts.
This is the interesting part about why mythologization taking place. No matter how you slice it, we have a problem. If there was historical accounts about Jesus, and I've actually have some people who think he was a seditious leader, like the previous question, that he was a rebel leader as described what Acts talks about, guys, Judas the Galilean, and you name it, these people who were real rebel
Which is totally
types.
Credible, but sorry, I'm interrupting you. Totally credible, but it just means the Gospels are completely mythologizing the actual facts of what happened. Yeah,
right. Sorry. Now imagine he is that, right? Well, this is speculative, but at the end of the day, do you think Christian authors who now see Jesus as God are going to preserve literature or allow these historians to document about their peasant Jewish rabbi who's running around creating seditious movements in this region? You think that's going to still exist, or is this Jesus being God what is now going to be preserved and pushed? I mean, he is now deified. What you're going to remember of him isn't, if there were historical elements, and we don't even have all the histories that were written in the first century. There was another Jewish competitor historian to Josephus that we don't even have. And I wonder, you just kind of wonder, is there something there? Is there something that Vesuvius, the volcano? Is there any historical documents in the library that was buried there, as Richard Carey talks about? If there is, and we had early, because my epistemology is that there are no real miraculous things happening. These are embellishments. What we would find wouldn't be something I would expect Christians who have a deified Christ or a Christology that is significant are going to preserve. So you're stuck with this damned if you do, damned if you don't type of scenario. And having that early kernel, if it wasn't pretty, there's the interpolation idea of Josephus. Well, if it's partially interpolated, as some would say, and not all, but some would say, it wasn't pretty because it's wedged between very negative scenes. You have this over and over, these Jewish guys that are doing bad, or one's a Samaritan and such. They're not good looking. And then you have this guy who's God in the flesh. I mean, come on. So there's a bad situation. He's sandwiched in between, and it gets embellished. If we can call him a man, like, what the hell is going on? So it just makes me think they've tampered with the evidence to the point where at the end of the day, you can't blame mythicists for like being highly suspicious of the activities that are going on in the early church. They're wanting to burn different documents that might have ideas like Marcion, etc. You name it. They're stamping out and painting the story they want. So it's a speculation, but we do have a super chat.
Yeah.
Did you want to comment on that though?
No, that's fine. That's good.
Okay. John Alcorn, thank you so much for the super chat. He says, Mo money, Mo scholars. Thank you so much, my friend. That's what I do. You guys' super chats and the Patreon members, everything. That's I pay and I make sure that I can keep doing what I'm doing, bringing scholars on and trying to help these people continue to do this. So I also could flip the coin and just say what we do have preserved is positive for Jesus. We don't have, other than the skeptics that are found in the writings of the Christians who are writing against them.
Yeah, I'd love some of those to still exist. You know, Contra Celsum or whatever, how you pronounce it. You know, Celsus Celsus. And you know, Trifo. You know, where Justin Martyr writing against, you know, Jewish polemics. I'd love those original Jewish polemics to still exist, just so we could get a proper insight into what the counter arguments were at the time, you know, from the original sources.
Absolutely. I'm going to pick one or two more questions, then we can. I'm scrolling down. I'm trying to see. Yeah, Doc, just to address what you're saying, this isn't addressing the question. The Zealot movement sympathized with the nationalistic causes espoused by the Zealots and were awaiting a Messiah to seize the throne of Israel. Yeah, and there were many different types of movements. I mean, there were, you know, Richard Carrier talks about different kinds of Pharisees. There were not even the same types of Pharisees. There were so many different groups, and saying Jesus was a warrior zealot, you know, is one of many theories, one of many. So you can hypothesize, you know.
And I think it's quite difficult to understand who Jesus was in his lifetime as a cultic leader, or as a, you know, as a movement leader. What was his movement? Was it a more peaceful, you know, because when you read the Gospels, he seems very much revolutionary, but in a far more kind of socialist or you know, a peace loving kind of leader and movement, whereas some of these other zealot movements weren't so much, and they were maybe more political and maybe, you know, more anti-Roman or whatever. And so trying to unpick from the Gospels what kind of movement the Jesus movement really was, I think it's interesting, because it certainly wasn't what Jews would expect of a Messiah. So you generally get either a militaristic style Messiah being expected, or maybe a high priest style Messiah, right? Those are the two sort of, I think, the more common versions of an expected Messiah. Jesus didn't really fit into any of them, and so you know, I would like, if Jesus really existed, I would love to know exactly what he really was saying. I think I'd go along with Ehrman to say some of the gist memories we have. We could argue that some of the sayings that we find repeated in the Gospels may well have been sayings that Jesus said. In which case, was he really this kind of revolutionary, peace-loving leader? You know, and I think it's just interesting. I'd love to be a fly on the wall at that time.
Just to be able to see, like, give me a flashback. Yeah, I appreciate it. And then finally, did Jesus have a pet dinosaur?
7.
So okay. I kind of figured you were going to give that number, because that's how many days in Genesis, you know, all of that. So anyway, thank you so much. We've had a lot of fun. There seems to be just more of a conversation that goes back and forth in the chat. This always happens when I do lives, where people are like talking amongst themselves, and half the time they're not listening to the things we're doing. They're more like interested in their own little thing. So I was just going to take some Q&A, and on our way out, I didn't really see anything more assertions and claims rather than questions. So yeah. So with that being said, is there anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, no. So this was very much more kind of like, what do we know from Jewish law? What do we know from history about what death and burial would have looked like for Jesus? And it's definitely not what happened in the Gospels. There you go. And then in the next video. We'll look at maybe Matthew's guards at the tomb. We'll look at the empty tomb itself, maybe, and then the woman at the tomb, I think. So
yeah, Matthew's tomb. There's just so many more questions I'd like to get into as we go. There's the claim that they stole the body. Like, I like to pretend and speculate. What if that is a potential actual answer? I mean, these guys went and took the body and hid it, maybe for one of, I don't know, or took the body. Allison, Del Allison Jr., when I went and interviewed him, and I asked him, if you put your skeptic cap on, what's the most likely scenario you think? And he said that the body was stolen because there was a lot of magicians at this time, and they would use like kind of necromancy type strange corpse used in their potions and in their magical things.
Yeah.
He would think that someone stole the body of a man who claimed to be a magician, that his body would have some type of strange element that they would use in a magic or something like that. And I'm like, what the? I said, could you imagine if Jesus actually dies, right? And a complete pagan wild magician stole his body and was using him in incantations, and here are Christians thinking he's resurrected from the dead.
Some of these crazy theories about we'll talk about this in the very last video, which is of all the naturalistic theories about what happened to Jesus' body, what could explain the data. Some of them are wildly improbable. Like, you can talk about swoon theory, you can talk about twins. Jesus had a twin and one died and the other one, like identical twin, was like, hey, look at me, and everyone's thinking, hey, he's resurrected because he's died and he's just an identical twin. Bonkers and completely improbable, but still more probable than the Christian version.
Right. Yeah, there's just a bunch of different ones out there. And thank you. We are MythVision and we are Justin Bieber, someone said. And what hat? This is a Dragon Ball Z. Got it at GameStop. So for those of you who have kids and want to pretend that the kids are the ones who play video games and not you, you can go to GameStop and you can get you a Dragon Ball Z hat. Yeah.
And just for all the other people who are asking, if you want to be a chimney sweep, right, this is the hat that you want for doing that and going up chimneys and sweeping them if you live in Victorian times. So screw you, everyone. I've got a better hat. Yeah,
his hat's way better. I mean, it's just, I'm just representing another deity on mine. That's all. Scholar Vid has a super chat before we go. In Mark 15:34, God leaves Jesus before he dies. Doesn't that preclude any atonement for the origin sin upon his only human death?
I mean, I need to understand that question. There's an interesting idea about the baptism and the death, and about whether so this is a theory. This is where Mark is so different from John, right? So you can argue that Mark, and again Bart Ehrman makes this point, that Mark argues that Jesus was born at baptism. It wasn't the Logos, the dove and the baptism, and that Jesus then dies at this point, and you can say that's so which then is pretty much contradictory to what John says. So I think the atonement is so problematic. I don't think anything makes sense of the atonement. I don't know how even not that version of death makes sense of the atonement. I don't think. Yeah. So you could argue that precludes atonement for sin. But I think you can also argue that any of the interpretations of the gospel accounts of Jesus' death make no sense of atonement, because the atonement doesn't make sense. So, but I would need to sit down and think about that question in more depth. But I think to just repeat what I said, I think there is an interesting idea that John and Mark really do say two separate things about the beginning and end of Jesus' life.
Thank you. Appreciate that super chat, my friend. I just saw one interesting statement.
And in fact, they say loads of really interesting differences. Like the whole baptism is different, and why so, and also about how Jesus collects his first followers, about whether he just orders them to come follow him, they follow him straight away, or whether they know him already. The difference between John and the synoptics is a huge. Sorry, I'm going off.
No, you're good. Yeah. So this whole Derek, you missed the obvious. Jesus is in the Talmud, and Jesus is, but it's also late in the game. And why we don't really try to argue. A lot of people will go, if you don't have first century, I mean, you want the closest attestation you can to something. So, I mean, Talmud can be tacked on, but it could just mean that they later on, I mean, even in the Talmud, they blame Jesus for the destruction of Jerusalem, right? So is this not what the Gospels also are doing? Because the Gospels are saying, you know, don't weep for me, weep for your children and your children's children. Let his blood be upon us and our children. Oh, well, because y'all didn't believe in Jesus, the temple's getting destroyed. Well, the polemic could be in the Jewish Talmud that, well, we're blaming Jesus for the destruction of the temple because somehow he's involved in that way. Now we can hypothesize and come up with crazy ideas and then put them in the 60s and 70s that other people have postulated and whatnot to try and make that the case. There's people who've said Jesus belongs in 60s and 70s, right there before the Jewish war. You have some who said he was in the 50s. Lena Einhorn has this time shift theory that the Gospels are actually not in the right time in which they're documenting some of these events. And she has an interesting video. I've done a recording with her that's really fascinating that kind of points out some of the stuff that should be in the 40s, 50s. Rather than in the 30s, which might add something to the things you're saying here. But she also thinks that the Egyptian was Jesus. So it was, you know who the Egyptian was in Josephus?
Yeah, no, not anymore. No.
He's like a rebel type figure. He led a bunch of people to the Mount of Olives. And like, I think it was like 30,000. I don't know. It was a large number. And the Romans went out and they literally crushed these people and he escaped. So you see this interesting thing in Acts of the Apostles where Paul is accused of being the Egyptian.
Right.
It's like, where is this coming from? So there's just kind of like these little I don't know, you're doing a little Sherlock Holmes on maybe something going on early on.
That's interesting.
There are rumors maybe going on. I don't know. Trevor Gill says, hey, aren't we in agreement that Jesus never actually existed?
Well, we covered that one.
Yeah. We covered that one. So we're in agreement that the Christ never existed, that there was no one who walked on water, that there was no one who actually did these things. But as far as whether there was a guy at the basis, no. I mean, I think there probably was. I used to be mythicist, so I hope that answers your question.
But we did talk about it earlier. Maybe you missed the first half. So yeah.
Appreciate the super chat. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and look at Naked Jesus on our way out. Don't forget to check out his blog. I just popped that up at the last moment. That'll be down there in the description, as well as YouTube channel. Let's see if any of you guys subscribed. I've been putting this down here in the link. I'm going to do this on camera to see if I could trust you guys and gals.
That'd be amazing. Thank you. I mean, it's already I need to get off my arse and actually make some videos, which I have got one actually I'm due to put up. So thank you so much. My listenership has grown exponentially thanks to you.
Well, you rock, man. Let's keep it growing. I want to try and get you over 1,000 subscribers. We can get you monetized. Also, the book we're reading that we keep talking about, you can follow us through. We are just passing the halfway mark. Then there's also the nativity book that he has, and we're going to get into that one next. I feel like that's our next one.
Yeah.
I really want to get into the whole virgin birth and stuff like that. Yeah. And the Patreon. I just dropped this bomb of a 2-hour interview, and I have so many interviews. It's ridiculous. And then you just got to scroll down, then hit load more, and you can do that like 100 times, and you still won't cover all the videos. There's so many scholars, you name it. I don't even have the energy to explain how many are on there. So please help us out. Join the Patreon. Down in the description. Now to the Naked Jesus. We are MythVision.